Descartes Meditations. The title of the book is actually Meditations on First Philosophy. So first off, a couple words about this title. First, it is a book of meditations. Now, historically, there have been many books of meditations. Among the most famous, perhaps, Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher and Roman emperor's meditations, though he didn't give it that title. That was a title given to his thoughts that he wrote down. In a way, the Confessions of St. Augustine of Hippo are meditations. St. Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order, wrote a book called The Spiritual Exercises, which is a book of meditations. Descartes' book is unlike any of these or any of the other meditation books previous to him. First, all of those books would have begun with prayer or some kind of invocation of God. But Descartes, the first, doesn't really even mention God at the beginning of the meditations, and only mentions him in the first meditation in terms of the possibility that God could deceive us. We'll get to that in a few minutes. And he really doesn't have any immediate interest in God until the third meditation, when it becomes important as the way of getting out of a dilemma which he has created himself. So that's a fairly odd use of God in a work at this time period. Some people have suspected, in fact, that when Descartes does finally bring God into the meditations in the third meditation, it was because he was already getting some heat from people who noticed the absence of God in the first two meditations. So what exactly is the purpose of these meditations? Obviously, these are not spiritual meditations in the normal sense. Rather, Descartes wants to examine his own ideas. And so that's where he begins. He begins with thinking about his own thought, the nature of his own thought, and thinking about how disordered it is and how he would like to put it in order. Another thing that is missing here is the usual assumption that you would find, at least in Christian books of meditation, of human frailty or human fallenness. Descartes assumes that he will be able to fix his problems if he thinks about them hard enough. This also differs from Jewish, Christian, and Muslim anthropologies or ideas of the structure of human being, in that Descartes does not assume that we are a tripartite self, body, soul, and spirit, but that we are primarily intellect. We are primarily frontal lobe, rational thinking beings. So there's a lot of assumptions in this book that, first off, don't agree with the tradition that Descartes was presumably in, being a French Roman Catholic, and a lot of assumptions that Descartes, by his own principles, shouldn't be making. He wants to start without presuppositions, but here we already see he didn't really do that. So these are the meditations on first philosophy. First philosophy means metaphysics, and that's interesting because while Descartes apparently conceived of this book as metaphysical, ever since Descartes' time, it has been mainly dealt with from the standpoint of epistemology. And I think as we go on, we might ask ourselves the question, why did he consider this metaphysics? And is it really epistemology? It is true that every generation since Descartes has used Descartes as a kind of whipping boy or as somebody in support of their own positions. So in all the later debates, for example, the debate over empiricism and rationalism that takes place 100 years after Descartes, everybody was willing to either use Descartes to beat up on or use Descartes in defense of their position. And the same thing is true in postmodernism in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So finally on this slide, notice the quote, this is why perhaps philosophers are a publisher's bane. Uh, who else but a philosopher is going to start their book by saying, most of you should not read it because you're not serious enough? But that's essentially what Descartes says here. But I think it is a good point that he intended these as actual meditations that we would do along with him. And now they're very easy to read for the most part. I mean, that is, it's philosophy, so it's not terribly easy. But on the other hand, he's quite clear and he's pretty methodical. And I think you can read at least the first two meditations quite quickly. However, one of the things we'll do in one of the review sheets is I'll have you trace his arguments and how he goes back and forth and back and forth. That's another aspect of these as meditations, is what he's doing is having a discussion with himself, almost like a soliloquy in a play. He's talking to himself, and he wants us to do the same. Okay, a couple of notes before we get started on the meditations themselves. First, the required reading is Meditations 1, 2, and 3. Of course, you're encouraged to read more. This is one of the great works of philosophy, so it certainly would be a good thing to read more, but just the first three are required. The slide presentation is presented to follow the first three meditations. And to that end, I've given you the page numbers where you can find what is on the slide. The way the page numbers work is that the first number is the marginal page number, the page number in the margins of your text. And the second page number is your regular page number, which in this book is at the top right of the page, top right or left of the page, depending on which page it is. Now, this is based on the Cambridge Texts in the History of Philosophy edition, edited by John Cottingham. So if you have a different edition, the page numbers will be completely different. But it should what's presented on the slides should track through the meditation in order anyway. Descartes lived at the end of the Middle Ages, and his entire education was in medieval Roman Catholic schools. Science was not yet part of the formal curriculum of those schools. It was really a kind of extracurricular activity, I suppose. And so the scientific education and mathematical education that Descartes got was primarily from some of his professors who are also interested in science, but it was more of as a pastime. And he saw the potential in science for being the great form of knowledge that modern science ultimately became. We have to remember at this time, experimental method was still being worked out. Galileo had done some experiments like dropping different weighted balls from the Tower of Pisa, and that kind of thing. But really, those were more demonstrations of his theory rather than experiments to prove his theory. And so experimental method was still being worked out. One reason for the slow emergence of experimental method that I think is interesting is that experimentation is manual labor, and most of the educated people of the Middle Ages were upper class and wouldn't engage in manual labor. That was a servant's business. And so this was, as kind of one of many factors that led to the slow emergence of experimental method. Also, the application of math, algebra, and then later calculus to science was also just beginning. And if you read some of Descartes' other works, in particular the Discourse on Method, you'll see him talking about how he was coming up with ways to apply math to science. So he was an innovator there as well. So he had quite a bit of, he basically got the best education money could buy in early 16th century France. But he began to realize as he got into his adulthood that he had a head full of ideas that had no particular system, no particular order. and this began to trouble him. And he was an orderly in the like a medic, I suppose, in an army that was traveling to the coronation of a king. And on their way back, they were bivouacked, that is, living in the houses in a town. And he had some time off, and he had a nice room with a nice big fire, as he describes it in the Discourse on Method. And he said to himself, I thought that once in my life I needed to sit down and organize my thoughts. And so he first off searches for a method to do this. And he decides that he's going to have to, imagine a building that is supposed to have a solid foundation. And then the bricks of the building are piled up on that foundation in a neat order. Compared to that, he says, my ideas were like a jumbled mess. There was no foundation, there was no order, there was just a whole bunch of bricks and mortar and things lying around. And he said he realized that what he needed to find first off was a foundation on which all of the rest of his ideas could be built. Now, this idea of this sort of metaphor of knowledge as a building that is linear and symmetrical and geometrically precise is very much an idea that is associated with modernism. And modernism begins around this time. Now, a note on the word modernism can mean anything from the end of the Middle Ages, really up to now, although now we're in postmodernism as well. However, modern philosophy really signifies a narrower time period, starting with Descartes. Descartes is the father of modern philosophy. Certainly there were elements in medieval philosophy that lead up to Descartes, as we'll see, but Descartes really signals a break with the past for some of the reasons I've already noted. The reliance on human reason and the idea that reason should be absolutely orderly, clear and distinct, as he will say later. And this reliance on reason is really what marks modern philosophy. Modern philosophy begins with Descartes and ends with Kant, right around 1800 perhaps. Some people would stretch it to include Hegel, who dies in the 1820s. So he wants to find a foundation for his thought, for this, this very precise, geometrically precise building that he wants to create from his thoughts. And the only way to get that is to, he says, to effect a general demolition of all of his previous thought. Now, one of the things that's notable here is that Descartes absolutely does not do that. He does not actually destroy his previous thought. As a later philosopher, the founder of a type of philosophy known as phenomenology, Edmund Husserl, Husserl, we'll talk about him later. As Husserl says, what Descartes really does is bracket his thoughts. He kind of puts his thoughts, all of his thoughts that he has now, he kind of puts them in brackets and sets them aside, because he can't know whether they're valid or not, but you can't really destroy them either. The Cartesian methodological doubt points out that in this process, it's not necessary to doubt every belief one at a time. If you think about that, it would be crazy to attempt this, to doubt every single one of your beliefs one at a time. I would say even the dumbest person in the world has too many ideas to do that. But he points out if he could find out what the foundation of his present thoughts are, and then knock that down, then all of his thoughts will come tumbling down as well. And so that's what he tries to do, he says. So what is this false foundation on which all of his previous ideas are based? He says that false foundation is that all of his knowledge came from the senses. Everything he learned through the senses, and the senses can be deceiving. And here he gives the first and one of the most famous examples of how the senses can deceive us. We might be having sensory appearances that aren't actually happening. For example, when we're dreaming, we have experiences that seem like sensory experiences, but we're not in fact even conscious. And I think you could safely say, on the other hand, sometimes we're awake and feel like we could be dreaming. at any rate, this gets back to some of the matrix stuff we've studied now. For example, the brain in a vat type of scenario, where if we were a brain in a vat of liquid to preserve us, um, in a laboratory and hooked up to electrodes to have certain experiences, we would not be able to know that that wasn't an actual experience that we were having. The same as the human batteries in the Matrix movie. And so in that case, we can't trust the senses. And this is going to be really Descartes' obsession through almost all of the meditations, or all the meditations. And that is, A, we believe in the senses, we're habituated to believe in the senses, though they can be false. And B, it's incredibly hard to overcome that belief. And he's going to try a variety of techniques to overcome the belief in the senses. Before moving on, Descartes does what he does so often, which is he argues against himself. So one of the things you're going to do in the review sheets is you're going to trace how he argues back and forth and back and forth. So here's I think, probably the first example of that sort of what we might call it flip-flopping in his book, except that he's not flip-flopping, he's not changing his mind, but he is arguing with himself. This is like an internal dialogue that he's having with himself. So he says we can't trust the senses, but on the other hand, there are universal truths such as the categories and mathematical equations, which are much more certain than just random sensory things. The categories is a list of things. I think probably the first list of categories was formed by Aristotle, and what the categories are things which tell us what other things are, or you could say categories into which we put other things. So it could be height, weight, depth, substance, quantity, quality, position, relation. There's a whole list of them. And Aristotle had his list, and Immanuel Kant has his list. But at any rate, these are things that aren't things we directly perceive, but are conceptual constructions into which we place other ideas. Mathematical equations, likewise, seem pretty certain. 1 plus 1 is pretty much always true. A squared plus b squared equals c squared, pretty much always true. So these could be more certain. So then he responds to his criticism by saying that God could create us with the illusion of sensory objects. Now, this is the first mention of God, and notice that it is a mention of God, basically tricking us. So he could have given us bad math, and given that I'm a math phobe, I hope that that's the case. But at any rate, so this is his first argument, and he then goes on to say, no, it can't be that can't be the case, because whether directly or indirectly, the categories in mathematical equations are also ultimate. So he realizes how difficult it's going to be to actually undermine this false foundation of the senses. He asks himself, why does he continue to rely on the senses when he sees how deceptive they are? He says, because we're habituated to trusting the senses. And experience seems to validate that habituation, those habits that we formed. Most of the time, our senses mostly work. And when they don't work, we look at it as an anomaly, as a mistake, as something that doesn't fit the norm. And so he says to himself, I'm going to have to assume the opposite of my senses in order to overcome the habit I have of believing in the senses. So this is called hyperbolic doubt. Hyperbolic here is a form of rhetoric that the translation is just So the way that he is going to try to assume the opposite of his senses is to imagine that this demon created all of these appearances. And obviously we should not accept anything that could have been produced by this demon. He's pretty scary. Not sure how he breathes. Anyway, still Descartes says, again, as I said, this is sort of his obsession. Most philosophers have, a fairly narrow compass of questions with which they're obsessed, and Descartes' no different. He says, nevertheless, old habits of thought are difficult to overcome. We're like prisoners in a dream world. And I say they remind you of something. And of course, I'm thinking of Plato's cave. I think there are a lot of interesting and good comparisons to be made with Plato's cave. There are many similarities and differences. And I will ask you to think about some of that on the review sheet as well. At the beginning of the second meditation, Descartes says that he feels like he's lost in confusion, as if fallen into a whirlpool, and he says that he needs to find an Archimedean point. What he means by this is he's referring to Archimedes, the ancient Greek physicist or scientist, who one of the things he did, well, the thing he's most famous for is he sat down in an overfull bath and it spilled, and he realized from this the principle of displacement, and he jumped out of the bath and ran down the street yelling, "Eureka!" He found it. And what he had found was the solution to a problem that a king had given him of trying to figure out whether a golden crown was real gold or whether it was counterfeit. And using the principle of displacement, he could weigh the crown and figure out if it was a real crown or not. That's the most famous story about Archimedes. But Archimedes also worked out the mathematics for levers and pulleys. And levers and pulleys are extremely simple but very powerful machines. And in fact, Archimedes said that he could actually, do the math, show you exactly how big a lever and a fulcrum would have to be, such that if it, this is purely hypothetical, but if he could tell you how big it would have to be and where it would have to be placed in outer space to shift the Earth off its axis. So an Archimedean point is something so certain that it could, as it were, shift the Earth off its axis. But right now, Descartes is lost in skepticism toward pretty much everything. But then he realizes, and this is the first glimmer of where he's going, he realizes that even though he is doubting the existence of God, his own self, his senses, nevertheless, when he's doubting, he is thinking. And that's the realization that even when he's doubting, he is always still thinking, leads him to his most famous claim, which is cogito ergo sum. Now, actually, the phrase cogito ergo sum doesn't happen in the Meditations. You will find that phrase in the Discourse on Method. But he does use a variety of phrases that are somewhat similar, but I actually make an additional claim, which is that if he's thinking, he must exist. And so he equates it essentially to these three statements. I exist as long as I am thinking. I am a thing that thinks. I am a thinking thing. And he gives us a list of types of thinking. And he makes an important point, which is even if the objects of these thinking are unreal, the thinking is real. So even if you were thinking of a unicorn, it still proves you're thinking. So basically, the cogito is self-affirming, meaning if you doubt it, you prove it. So there is no way to undermine it with doubt. The image here, of course, is the famous sculpture of the thinker by the great 20th century French sculptor Auguste Rodin. But now that he's found a foundation, Descartes has also found himself in the middle of a huge problem, which is known as Cartesian dualism. That is, on the one hand, the world, which comprises the objects of our sense intuition, and intuition here doesn't mean a fuzzy feeling about something. Intuition is a technical term in modern philosophy that means, we would say input, or we could say sense perception. So the knowledge of the world that comes through sense perception is completely doubtful. We cannot prove that the world exists independently of our consciousness in the way that our consciousness gives it to us because the only way we get the world is through our consciousness. So that's absolutely uncertain, and that's what the brackets indicate. Is he said he was going to destroy his previous ideas. As we said at the beginning, he doesn't really do that, but what he does is kind of bracket them and set them aside. And then he looks at the cogito itself, and the arrow indicates the cogito, again, is self-affirming. That is, even if you doubt it, it actually proves it, because if you're doubting your thinking, and therefore that proves cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. The problem is now we have this dualism, inside-outside dualism, sometimes it's called, or mind-body dualism, where the world is absolutely uncertain, and the cogito, which is pretty much has no content, is absolutely certain. So now Descartes has to figure out how he's going to bridge the gap, as it were. And he decides that, well, he can't trust corporeal objects, that is, bodily objects, because even though they seem more distinct than the self does, that's, again, because we're habituated to wandering in appearances, as he says. So, what we need are ideas that are more distinct than sensory input or the images of corporeal objects. After all, he again points out how doubtful, here's another example of how doubtful the objects of our senses are. You see in the picture what looks like a horse. It is in fact a picture of a cliffside and the ocean. This is an optical illusion. I only picked this particular optical illusion just because it was different from some of the famous ones, such as the two vases that form a face, or when you adjust your eye, you can either see the vases or you can see the face, but you can't see both at the same time. Or the example of the picture of the old crone, who then, if you adjust your eyesight again, becomes a picture of a beautiful young woman. Or any of Escher's prints, many of Escher's prints anyway. If you haven't looked at Escher, Escher, recommend you go to Google and just type in Escher and then click on images, and you'll see a number of really cool, kind of mind-bending images. But what this points out is that what we think we're seeing isn't nearly as distinct and clear as we think it is. And that brings us to the lump of wax example. Wax here refers to some honeycomb, fresh honeycomb, that Descartes has, straight from the bee's hive. And according to the internet, what we see here in a bowl, it looks to me like fried chicken, but they say it's honeycomb. So this is an example of why we cannot trust the senses. It is, by the way, also the topic of your second and last paper for the semester, and so you'll be wanting to look at that paper assignment, which refers to this example. So he says the sensory qualities seem to be distinctly known. In other words, what comes through our senses we tend to believe in. But let's look at just like give a sensory description of this lump of wax that he has, this fresh honeycomb. And if we described it, now I'm going to break it down a little bit more than he does, but if we describe it, for example, to the touch it would be sticky, to the smell it would be sweet, to the taste it would be sweet, to the hearing, if you thumped it, it would be squishy. And what have I missed? Oh, to the sight, it's golden. Now, however, if we take the same lump of wax and it gets over too close to the fire and gets burned, now let's describe the sensory properties. Now it is blackened, the taste is bitter, the smell is acrid, the feel of it is crispy, and the what am I missing? To the hearing, it's when you thump it, it's crunchy. So our senses would tell us that the fresh wax and the burnt wax are two completely different things if we just believed our senses. Our senses would tell us that it's two completely different things. But our minds know better. Our minds know it's two different states of the same thing. So what this leads Descartes to realize is that it isn't our senses that give us knowledge. It is, in this case, a judgment. We don't actually pay attention to what the senses tell us. We actually make a judgment that overrules the senses, as it were. And so to conclude the second meditation, Descartes just sort of sums up the situation that his thinking has gotten himself in. The existence of the self is more certain than sense knowledge. All sense knowledge leads back to the thinking self, and that all bodies are known through the intellect alone. But this still leaves the problem of Cartesian dualism in place, and that's what he's going to have to work out in the third meditation. So what he's looking for here are clear and distinct ideas that are as certain as the cogito itself. In other words, basically self-affirming. And he says that the criterion for certainty is that these ideas will appear before the mind in such a way that they can't not be true. Now, this might seem a kind of fuzzy criterion for something that's supposed to be clear and certain. But think of something like, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all humans are created equal, etc. This idea of self-evident ideas, ideas that just by their own nature are obvious to any rational being, Descartes thinks we can arrive at these, and that's what he's going to try to do. In my reading of this meditation, which by the way is, you'll notice, much longer than either of the first two meditations and much more complicated, I see Descartes trying out two different classifications of types of thought, trying to figure out how to get to clear and distinct ideas. And really it's his third attempt that leads him forward, as we'll. In his first attempt at classifying the types of thoughts, Descartes distinguishes between two classes. First, ideas, which are images of things. The root word of ideas is the same as the root word of idol, which is another type of image. And again, these ideas can be images of anything. They can be images of real things like a man or the sky, or they could be images of imaginary things like a chimera. And you see a chimera here with the head of a lion, a snake's tail, and a goat head growing out of its back, one of the stranger mythological creatures. But it doesn't matter that it's not real, because it still does point back to the cogito. In this first classification of the types of thought, the second category consists of volitions, emotions, and judgments. And these are objects of thought that Descartes says seem to contain something more than just the thought itself. Again, he says ideas can't be false in the sense of, in the sense of being, it doesn't matter whether they're mistaken or not, or they're of imaginary things. As he says, the idea of a chimera is as real as the idea of a real goat. Same thing goes for emotions. Emotions might even have non-existent objects, or they might be false in some other way, but they again point back to the cogito. Judgments, likewise, there's a trick. Judgments seem to refer things outside of me, but given the status of Cartesian dualism and methodological doubt, we can't refer to anything outside of us. Here, we have to remember that judgments are purely mental processes. By the way, volitions, the word up at the top there, volitions, refers to the faculty. Volition is the faculty of will, so these are things that we will. Since the first classification of the types of thoughts didn't get Descartes very far, he tries another one, looking at three types of ideas: innate, adventitious, and inventions. Innate ideas are literally inborn ideas, ideas that you could say consciousness is hardwired with, such as understanding of what a thing is, what truth is, what thought is. Descartes thinks these are, again, sort of self-evident ideas, ideas rooted in the nature of the mind itself. Um, and I think this is really the point at which Descartes could have been 150 years ahead of his own time if he had thought it through more, because I think this is really where the element of consciousness that Kant is able to analyze and to extend the analysis of. And if Descartes had focused more completely on this, he might have done what Kant did later. But at any rate, he does recognize that consciousness provides meaning in some sense to what is given us by the senses, but he never fully makes the sort of what is called the transcendental turn that Kant. Second group of ideas in this second classification are adventitious ideas, or, as the footnote says, ideas that seem foreign to me and coming from the outside. Another way of understanding adventitious ideas is they are ideas that happen whether we will them or not. If the sun is out and we're out in the sun, we feel the heat from the sun whether we want to or not. If we stub our toe, it's not like we say, okay, I'm ready for the pain. Now pain go up, through my nerve endings and up through my spine to my brain, and then you feel the pain. No, it just happens automatically. So those adventitious ideas are particularly tricky because they seem to refer to this, outside the cogito, which again, Descartes has not gotten outside the cogito. And the third group of ideas in this second classification of the types of thought are inventions. And so he mentions sirens and hippogriffs. So here at the bottom I've given you the sirens from the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, which if you haven't seen it, I would highly, highly recommend it. And of course the hippogriff from Harry Potter, Buckbeak, alias Witherwings, of course, when he. So neither of these classifications of ideas seem to have gotten Descartes to the point where he can fully believe in the nature of the cogito and not rely on the senses. And again, he comes back, as I said, to sort of his obsession. Why is this belief so powerful when I know that it can't be fully trusted? And again, here he says that the belief is powerful because our innate nature teaches us that it's true. In other words, that the idea of the quote-unquote external world is given to us by consciousness itself. And that would be indicated by, for example, adventitious ideas. And so he adds a criterion to his original criterion for certainty. That is, he's looking for clear and distinct ideas. Now he adds the phrase, by the natural light. Clear and distinct ideas by the light of the mind. And those things revealed by the natural light, unlike sensory objects, would be indubitable, undoubtable. Now he brings up another example of why we shouldn't trust the senses. You can see it in the picture, that the sun can appear both large and small. By the way, you can do this with your fingers to just about anything that's at any kind of distance, not just the sun, but another optical illusion. And again, belief in objects external to us is unreasonable. The objects that show up to the mind, it's perfectly reasonable to believe in them, but to believe that they exist in a world independent of our consciousness is what is unreasonable. And this brings us to what I call the Cartesian axiomata. Axiomata is just the proper Greek plural of where we would say axioms with an S. Axiomatic logic is an ancient type of logic where you start with basic presuppositions that can't be doubted, and you just keep building on those basic presuppositions. So probably the most famous example would be Euclid's geometry, in which he starts with a definition of a point. And the definition of a point it should be so clear and distinct by the light of natural reason. It should be so obvious that you wouldn't doubt it. So then you would go to the second axiom, which would be the definition of a line, the distance between 2 points, and that would also be just as obvious as the first axiom. And then you get the third axiom, which gives you a plane, P-L-A-N-E, and then if you know, then axiom 1, 2, and 3 would lead you ultimately to the cube, etc., etc., and he builds his whole geometry in this axiomatic way. In these passages in the third meditation, Descartes reasons axiomatically. Now, I have had to rearrange slightly the first 3 axioms to make them have a more logical sequence, but the same thing. He starts with something that most people at his time anyway would have regarded as absolutely obvious. It's actually one of the oldest ideas in philosophy, going back to the pre-Socratics. Something cannot arise from nothing. Nihilo ex nihil fit, if you want the Latin. And so something cannot arise from nothing seems, logically obvious. So that leads to axiom 2. Some things have more reality than other things. And now, we discussed earlier in the semester that the ancient Greeks had an idea that there were things with more reality and things with less reality. That we talked about the microcosm, macrocosm analogy, that the reality is structured, that as you go up you get more reality, and but that at each stage of reality it has the same structure, and therefore the higher structures are analogies, or they can be compared to the lower structures. So, for example, Plato said the state is the soul writ large, by which he meant the state is a big version of the human self. That idea, again, one of the most ancient ideas, and here Descartes picking up on it. Some things have more reality than other things. Axiom 3 doesn't read nearly as clear, but it's based pretty closely on Axiom 2. It says basically that things with more reality give rise to things with less reality, not the other way around. So you can't have an effect from something that has less reality than it. And Axiom 4 states it in a slightly different way, bringing in this language of perfection that we'll have to talk more about. But what's more perfect has more reality. So it's basically just kind of a restatement of Axiom 3. What is more perfect cannot arise from what is less perfect, which is to say, what has more reality cannot arise from what has less reality. Which, to put it very simply, is why parents give rise to children, not the other way around. Axiom 5, this one's a little confusing because some of the language is a little different than what we might think. But what he's saying is that all of the previous axioms are true not only of things with objective reality, that is corporeal reality, bodily reality, but are also true of ideas. And this is an important point and a pretty weird one. It is to say, ideas with more reality give rise to ideas with less reality, or ideas that are more perfect give rise to ideas that are less perfect. And so objective reality here is kind of a weird term because he's referring to ideas, whereas we would think of objective reality as the reality of objects, which is kind of strange language. But some of these ideas, as I said, he's getting from ancient philosophy. A lot of these are from medieval Roman Catholic theology. And so some of the terminology might be a little different because of that. Axiom 6, he just says that an idea is not less real because it doesn't have bodily reality. So ideas are just as real as things, I think we could safely say. Axiom 7, in ideas as in nature, there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. Well, this is actually what is known as the cosmological argument. And it goes back to at least Plato and probably before. It says that every effect has a preceding cause. But every cause is the effect of a cause preceding it. And so this forms a chain with, cause caused by a cause caused by a cause going, and it could go back to infinity. But the Greeks always said that infinity is not a rational concept because you can't contain infinity in an idea. And therefore, the conclusion is there must be a first cause. Plato and Aristotle both came to this conclusion. Aristotle called it the first moved mover. I'm sorry, the first moved mover, the first cause or the unmoved mover that gave rise to everything. And so Descartes here is saying there can't be an infinite regress of causes. An infinite regress would be we go back in time and it has no beginning point. And so there must be a first cause, a primary idea. And notice that given everything else he said, this first cause would not only be the first idea, it would also be the idea with the most reality. So now he has the idea of a first cause and this cause also has the most being of all other causes and gives rise to all other causes. And this leads him down a train of thought that will lead him to using the idea of God in order to get out of Cartesian dualism. We'll get there in a minute. First, he says, given that things with more reality give rise to things with less reality, could I produce all of the ideas I have of corporeal things? If I'm looking and I see, a lamp and a desk, and I look out the window and I see nature, do I have enough reality to give rise to those ideas? Could those ideas be produced by me? And he says, yeah, they could be produced by me by putting together bits and pieces of all the different things I've encountered. So, the brain has the power to synthesize all these different perceptions and give me this reality. But by the same token, he asks the question, could the idea of God originate in me? And so he goes on to answer this question, goes on to define God. God is a being with all perfections, he says. Now, the word perfection means the same thing as attribute, quality, or predicate. So those four words are synonyms, and at least in regard to the qualities of God. So that's what he's talking about here. He's giving us a list of the perfections or attributes of God, that God is infinite, eternal, immutable, independent, omniscient, omnipotent, creator of all things. So then he asks himself, could I invent these attributes? And he says the only way that I'm not a being, given that I'm not an infinite being, I don't have enough reality to produce the idea of infinity. And therefore the idea of infinity could only have been produced in me by an actually existing infinite being. Therefore God exists. So Descartes utilizes two of the ancient proofs of the existence of God. The first, the cosmological argument. I only earlier called it the cosmological argument. I didn't say the cosmological argument for the existence of God, because in fact the cosmological argument doesn't prove the existence of God. Logically speaking, the cosmological argument only proves the existence of a first cause, or what Aristotle called an unmoved mover. And that could be God, or it could be a team of gods, I suppose, or a god and a god procreating, or a crack in the cosmic egg, or a super hot, super dense singularity at the heart of the void that explodes one day for no reason. In other words, the Big Bang. Or it could be a whole lot of things. So the cosmological argument gets you back to the first cause. But then if you want to say the first cause is specifically God, then you have to find some other arguments to show that it has the characteristics of God. Now, I mean, it does have the characteristic of having more reality than anything else, so, that might not be that hard to do. The ontological argument actually goes back into ancient times as well. The most famous version, though, comes from St. Anselm of Canterbury in about the 14th century, and we'll talk about that one later on when we talk about philosophy of religion. But he continues with the ontological proof. He says he couldn't produce himself. he doesn't have enough reality to produce himself. He can't even ensure his own existence. He asks himself whether his parents could have produced the idea of infinity that he has, and he says no, his parents wouldn't have had enough reality either. He says, well, maybe the idea of infinity was developed from combining other attributes. And he says, no, that won't work because one of the attributes of God is unity. So the different ideas can't come from different places. He says the idea of God has nothing to do with coming through the senses, it's innate. And if it is innate, then it is in the mind, independent of whether we want it or not. Therefore, it had to come from someplace. And the only place it could have come from, given that the idea of God is, of this infinite perfect being, is an actually existing infinite perfect being. And so he concludes the third meditation. I recognize that it would be impossible for me to exist with the kind of nature I have, that is, having within me the idea of God, were it not the case that God really existed. Now, one last thing. This doesn't get us out of Cartesian dualism. So if you'll refer back to that slide and remind yourself of Cartesian dualism, we have the problem that the world and the sense perceptions we have coming from the world is ultimately doubtful. And we have to set aside whether it exists independently of our consciousness or not. And then the cogito is absolutely self-affirming, but really hard to focus on or really hard to know because of all the distractions from the senses, among other things. And how can we bridge this dualism, this cogito world or inside-outside or mind-body dualism? Well, now he has the existence of God. So now, again, some people have suspected Descartes of not being quite authentic about bringing God in this way. And it is only God as the result of a logical proof, not, this isn't a statement of faith by any means. But to give him the benefit of the doubt, we'll say that he actually believed what he wrote, and he has the idea of God. How does that help him out of Cartesian dualism? Well, God, put the idea of infinity, put the idea of God in us, so that can assure us of our existence. And God would not trick us about the nature of the world that we perceive, and therefore, indirectly at least, we can rely that the world exists in some sense the same as it shows up to our consciousness. So that's about the strongest conclusion he can make at this point. And you'll have to read the rest of the meditations to see if he manages to make this a bit stronger.